later, with the development of these works, they were evaluated and they all led to me being elected into the Academy of Sciences. The research part of the work was awarded the USSR State Prize. The applied part was awarded the Lenin Prize. Thanks to my successful work in this field, the director of the institute had noticed me and moved me closer to himself and made me deputy director of the institute. Scientific functions were limited to my own science works. According to the distribution of responsibilities that existed in our directorate, which still exists today, I was assigned the following tasks: chemical physics, radiochemical physics, and using of nuclear and plasma sources for technological purposes. This was the scope of the professional tasks that I was engaged in. After Anatoly Petrovich Alexandrov was elected as a president for the USSR Academy of Sciences, he then made me the first deputy of the institute, entrusting me with a large range of responsibilities related to the management of the institute, but did not change my scientific tasks. As before, Yevgeny Pavlovich Velikov was responsible for the biggest chunk of the work that the Institute of Plasma Physics and Controlled Thermonuclear Fusion was performing. Vyacheslav Dmitrievich Pizmieny was made responsible for the laser technology. For the matters regarding nuclear physics and its special practical applications, Lev Pietrovich Feoktistov, a very clever and talented man, was appointed. Anatoly Petrovich had a deputy in nuclear energetics, Yevgeny Petrovich Ryzantsev. His predecessor in the director's position in the Department of Nuclear Reactors was Viktor Alexeyevich Sidorenko. Now, Ponomaryov Stepnoy became the first deputy of nuclear energetics who was engaged in reactor construction. Anatoly Pavlovich was himself a reactor man who had built or took part in creation of lots of reactors, so I was important to him, but not as necessarily a reactor scientist, but as a person who can give some unusual advice and provide some non-trivial insights. But all those decisions and advice were concerning possible fields of usage of the components that are inside the reactor, not the reactor construction itself, which I never took part of. Because of the questions of safety in nuclear energetics are very important in different segments of international public opinion, it was interesting for me to compare the real dangers and threats of nuclear energetics to those of other energetic systems. This is why I was passionately doing, mainly discovering dangers in other energy sources that are alternative to nuclear energy. This was the range of tasks which I was dealing with, while also to actively help Anatoly Petrovich with managing the institute, taking into account his occupation in the Science Academy. These tasks included the planning of the work of the institute, the regime of its work. I have tried to create many such things that would unite the institute. Kurchatov Council, the seminar of the institute, various publishing works for the science teams, so they can organize them and quickly get all the news from their fields of action. I have tried to organize such possibilities when it would be possible to compare various points of view, various approaches to problems of physics and energetics. This is also what I have been doing quite passionately. As for the physics and technology of the reactor, this field was a taboo for me, both regarding my education and because of Anatoly Pavlovich Alexandrov and his subordinates who worked there. They really disliked anyone interrupting their professional work. I remember one time when Lev Petrovich Feoktistov, just after beginning work at our institute, had made an attempt to conceptually analyze questions about a more reliable reactor, one that would not create such materials which could be taken out of the reactor and be used in a nuclear weapon. but his proposals were met with hostility. Same for another newly arrived employee, Viktor Orlov, who proposed a newer and safer reactor. Those proposals somehow were not taken into consideration at all by the established reactor community. I didn't have administrative power over the reactor division, but I had an overall understanding about many specific details. I was mainly concerned about what was going on, so I had to begin to offer an engineering rather than a physical approach to solving problems to the reactor community, but of course I couldn't considerably change the general landscape. Anatoly Petrovich had a trait which was very humanly understandable and maybe even attractive, which was the reliance on people with whom he has worked for a long time. So once he had relied on some people who, let's say, were dealing with the Navy, stationary machines, or specialized ones, he didn't like it at all when new people or people who would make him worry or make him doubt the decisions he had made earlier would appear in his circle. This is how things were going. From a scientific point of view, I have chosen a very interesting field that I have already been talking about: chemical physics associated with the creation of unusual substances, creating systems which would allow to obtain hydrogen one way or another to tie places where that hydrogen is obtained to the nuclear energy generation sites. I have done this passionately and also attracted external organizations. My field of action occupied a relatively small portion of our institute, both from a financial and a human resource perspective. People were very active, interesting, were proposing a lot of unordinary decisions, which ignited a lot of discussions. This whole situation made it appear that a lot of attention is paid to it, while in reality, this was the activity of new people who had just arrived into a new industry. I was a member of the Science and Technical Council of the Media Machine Building Ministry of the USSR, but I wasn't a member of the reactor part of this council. This is why I wasn't aware of many details and particular discussions. The Science Technical Council of the Institute frequently held discussions about concepts of development of nuclear energetics, but very rarely the technical aspects, such as the quality of the reactors, the quality of fuel, problems that were there. These things were discussed either in reactor segments of the ministry or in scientific and technical councils of the relevant departments. Nevertheless, the information we had was convincing us that not everything was well in the development of nuclear energy, as it seemed to me. It was clear that our devices fundamentally weren't different from the Western ones, save by their conception, in some aspect even surpassing them. But they lacked good control systems and were very lacking proper diagnostic systems. Also, for example, an American Nuclear Institute had performed an analysis of nuclear power plants. They consequently were searching for possible causes of some unpleasant situations that would lead to accidents and systemized them, made evaluation for certain events, estimates, and probabilities of events that may occur or lead to radioactivity escaping the core. We only got to know about that from abroad sources. I haven't seen anybody in the Soviet Union who more or less expertly considered such questions. The most active advocate for the safety of nuclear power in our country was Viktor Alexeyevich Dorenko. It seemed to me that his approach to the safety questions was very serious. That's because he actually knew how stations were operated, how the equipment was manufactured, and what unpleasant events have happened there. However, his effort was directed mostly towards resolving these situations. Firstly, by organizational means. Secondly, by better documentation system. Thirdly, he was really concerned about overseeing organizations that had to control the situation. This is what he called organizational means. Him and his like-minders were quite concerned with the quality of the equipment that was delivered to the station. Recently, we started to be more anxious about the learning and training quality of the personnel who were designing, building, and operating the nuclear power stations. That's because the number of stations had increased, but the quality of the personnel that took part in this process, as it seems, lowered and was lowering before our eyes. Around these questions, I would say that Viktor Alexandrovich Sidorenko was the leader of those people who showed concern. He did not receive proper support in our ministry. Every document, every step was made with agonizing difficulty. And the same thing is psychologically understandable, because the department in which we all worked was built on the principles of the highest qualifications of people who performed any operation with the highest responsibility. And actually, in the hands of people that were performing their job well, our devices seemed to be reliable and safe to operate. In this circle, the concern about additional measures to improve the safety of nuclear power plants seemed like a far-fetched question, because it was an environment of highly qualified people who gotten used to relying and were convinced that safety issues were solved solely by the skill and accuracy of instructing the personnel who led the process. This all had a calming effect. Even science projects that were directed on solving the further station improvement, both from a safety and from an economic point of view, were not receiving support. More and more resources have been spent to create facilities that are not directly related to atomic energy. Player manufacturing facilities were created, metallurgical and metal science facilities. A lot of construction resources were spent when creating objects that were not related to the institution. Science organizations began to weaken, not strengthen. These science organizations, which were once the most powerful in the country, began to lose the level of modern equipment. The staff was becoming older on average. Less young people joined in. New approaches were less and less welcome. This happened gradually, hard to see, but it was happening. The usual rhythm of work prevailed, the usual approach to solving certain problems. I had witnessed all of that, but it was really hard for me to interrupt the process from a purely professional point of view, while overall declarations about it were received with hostility. That's because when a non-professional tries to change someone's way of work, it cannot seem acceptable. New buildings were constantly in need, new installations, new people for performing work, because the number of objects grew constantly. But that growth was not qualitative, but rather quantitative. Moreover, the new specialists with these qualifications had the same reactor development and design degree, and they had a practice period afterwards. A good experienced reactor specialist was the one who knew well the design of a particular reactor, who knew all the accidental cases that happened, who could come to any object and help its physical and energetical launch, or quickly understand what's going on and report it to the ministry or institute. And so we got a large amount of engineers who knew their work very well, but were not critical enough towards the devices themselves. They were not critical enough towards the systems that were ensuring their safety, but mainly knew these systems and demanded to increase their number. This situation wasn't at all normal for the Science and Research Center. Many talks about strengthening the development organizations with specialists of such sort and with such approaches have been ongoing for decades on a professional or on a party level. But in practice, these organizations did not consolidate, except for one of them maybe. So the following picture was taking shape. All is good, and all that is needed is just growing the quantity of known installations, people all of which were working by known algorithm, and all would be fine. The worm of doubt tormented me. because in my professional field, it seemed to me that things should be done differently. Something new has to be done, and be very critical to what was done before. We needed to move aside and do something differently than before. Risks also had to be taken in this line of work, and I did risk a lot. In my life, neither short of long, I had to lead 10 projects on a global scale. And I must say that 5 of them had failed, which costed the government around 25 million rubles of losses. These projects failed not because they were wrong initially. They were engaging, interesting, but as it appeared, there were no required materials or scientists couldn't or didn't want to develop them. Or there were no organizations that would take on the development of non-trivial compressor or heat exchanger, with reference again to the lack of necessary materials or experience. As a result, initially attractive projects turned out to be very expensive, cumbersome, and not accepted for execution. This is how 5 of the 10 projects became a failure. 2 more of them, I'm afraid, would also become failures as well, because of the same reasons. Where 3 projects appeared to be very successful, where we had found good partners, and where we put maximum effort together with using the highest echelons of power, using the authority of Anatoly Pavlovich and the Central Committee of the party. As a result, just 1 of 3 successful projects that cost us 17 million rubles began to generate an annual income of 115 million rubles. The corresponding industry and equipment have been operating for 4 years now. It brought more than 500 million rubles of revenue to the state, which more than covered the 25 million rubles of expenses from the project that have not ended positively. But the amount of risks in my own projects was high. Well, 30, 50 or 70% of risks is high. But it also had an astonishing effect when the work had actually been completed. I didn't see anything similar in the reactor field, and so my attention was drawn to a high-temperature helium-cooled reactor and a liquid salt reactor, because these were something unseen, something new. Although not entirely new, because both of the reactors were tried out by the Americans. Gas-cooled reactors were also tried out by the Germans. They had shown their excellent superiorities from an efficiency point of view, from a cooling water consumption point of view, and from the width of the usage zone of such reactors in technological processes. These reactors appeared like something new to me, and also safer than traditional ones. That's why I provided some sort of patronage for these projects. More than that, in my professional work, I have taken some participation in those research areas. But I wasn't really interested in traditional reactor construction. It wasn't assigned to me, and also it seemed rather boring. Of course, I could not imagine the degree of its danger at that time, the scale of the danger inherent in these old machineries. But there was a certain feeling of anxiety and unease. However, there were so many experienced people, giants, experts in building reactors, that it seemed to me that they would not allow for something bad to happen. And because the literature on the subject, the most precise one, had Western origin, comparing Western devices with our own allowed me to draw conclusions for some books and articles. Although there were many problems related to the safety of existing devices and installations, there were still less than the dangers coming from the traditional energy with its large number of carcinogenic substances released into the atmosphere. And so to speak, I paid more attention to this side of things.